Hey everyone, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and I'm starting my new series on chess defenses from black. And the first defense I'm going to examine is Alekhine's defense. Alekhine's defense is a hyper-modern defense, meaning black is going to attack the center with its minor pieces instead of its pawns. Alekhine's defense is named after the Russian Grandmaster Alexander Alekhine. The move knight to f6 had been played before by black for some time, but it was Alekhine who developed the theory of the defense, showcasing it in a tournament in Budapest in 1921. The stats for the Alekhine I got from chessgames.com, and they're pretty good. 36.6% win for white, 33.6% win for black, and a 29.8% draw. I should say, though, that I've come across other stats which indicate that the Alekhines is better for drawing than for winning from black's perspective. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that the Alekhine, if played correctly, is a solid defense against the king's pawn opening. One reason for this is that, like the Sicilian, it breaks the symmetry of the board immediately, meaning both players must play sharply. Now, there are three main variations of the Alekhine: the four pawns attack, which is the focus of this video, and the exchange and modern variations, which will be covered in subsequent videos. But in the four pawn attack, there are a lot of lines to cover, and I've got now less than 15 minutes, so let's get started. So, white opens the game with pawn to e4, and black develops its knight immediately to f6. White pushes the pawn to e5, attacking the knight, and the knight jumps to d5. This baits out the pawn to play to c4 and attack the knight again, and from here black can retreat can retreat the knight to b6. From here, white plays d4, solidifying its pawn center, and black plays pawn to d6, getting ready to attack that center. Now from here, white can go into the four pawn attack with f4. However, if white isn't too familiar with the Alekhine, they might make a mistake and develop knight to f3. Now, this is a natural-looking move, developing a piece and defending the center, but it allows black to quickly undermine white's center. For example, you can have bishop come down to g4, pinning the knight down to the queen. White can play bishop to e2, immediately breaking that pin. From here, black can capture on e5, and white can push the pawn to c5, attacking the knight, but from here, black can just push the pawn to e4 and attack white's knight in return. White can capture the knight on b6, and black can capture the knight on f3, and after a series of exchanges on f3, black can play knight to c6. And as you can see, white's center is now completely gone. It has an isolated d-pawn and an overextended pawn on b6. This is not what white wants to do in the Alekhine defense. White wants to maintain its center as long as possible. So that's why in this position on move 5, if we go back, on move 5, it's much safer for white simply to go into the four pawn attack. Now from here, black actually has two options. Black can play the classical d captures e, or it can also play the fairly new and aggressive pawn to g5. We're going to take a look at pawn to g5 first before we continue on with the main lines. So if a white player isn't too familiar with pawn to g5, they might make a blunder and capture. And what that would look like from here is black can capture the pawn on e5. White can push the pawn to d5. Black can push pawn to e6. White can develop the knight to f3. You have black capture on d5. White develop its bishop to e2. You have pawn to e4 attacking the knight. The knight jumps to e5. We have queen out to e7, which is attacking the undefended knight, and it has nowhere to go except for g4. From here, the bishop can capture the knight on g4, and the bishop for white can recapture on g4. From here, though, white can hit a check with queen to b4, and after white blocks the check with knight to c3, black can capture the pawn on c4. And as you can see in this position, all of a sudden black has a beautiful center and white is on its heels. It has no pawns in the center and has completely screwed up. So that's why playing pawn captures on g5 here is a mistake. It simply weakens white's center and allows black to go on the attack. One variation that you might see after pawn to g5 is also queen to h5. Now from here, what you'll see more likely than not is the pawn capture on e5. white can develop its knight to f3. Black can develop its bishop to f5. White can capture the pawn on e5. Black develops its knight to c6. White captures the pawn on g5, attacking the undefended bishop, and so black defends with pawn to e6, and you'll notice that this is also opening up access for the queens to each other. White can continue with development, playing bishop to e3. Black can play knight down to b4, which would be threatening a fork on c2. And so to defend against the fork, white has to play knight out to a3. Now, in this position, as you can see here, it's pretty wild. It's hard to tell if a queen exchange is in black's best interest, but the queen on g5 is very menacing. However, black isn't lost because it has a lot of pressure on the c2 square, and white has this awkward knight sitting here on a3. Finally, one more variation that you might see if you play pawn to g5 is the variation that is recognized by people nowadays to be the best for white, and that is simply to capture the pawn on capture the pawn on d6. So from here, the play can continue as follows, with the queen capturing on d6, and after white pushes the pawn to c5, which is forking the queen and the knight, black can actually just hit a check with queen to e6. Now, in this position, it's actually not in white's interest to block the check with the queen. For instance, if white blocks the check with the queen, then you have black rescuing the knight, jumping it to d5. White can exchange the queens on e6, and after the bishop recaptures, you can have the pawn capture on g5. Black fianchetted this bishop on g7, which is putting an attacker on a currently undefended d4 pawn. So white defends by playing knight to f3. You have black develop its knight out to c6, getting another attacker on the d4 pawn. From here, you can have the white bishop come out to b5, pinning down the knight to the king. From here, black can jump its knight to b4, which is again threatening a fork on c2, and so to defend against it, white has to play knight out to a3, and black can castle long. As you can see in this position, black has a lot of pressure on d4 and is fully developed, whereas white again has the knight on the rim of the board. If you've heard the saying, knights on the rim are dim, it's because this knight is only impacting 3 squares. You have b5, c4, and c2, and it's currently defended. It's currently married down to the defense of the fork on the c2 square. A knight in the center of the board is obviously going to be much more active. Also, it should be said that black here is fully developed, whereas white isn't quite developed yet. It still has to castle and develop its bishop on c1. So that's why after the queen check here, after the queen check on e6, it's actually much better for the king to simply move to f2, and play can continue as follows. Black can save the knight and jump it to d5. White can develop its bishop to c4, pinning down the knight to the queen. Black can capture the pawn on f4, and before white recaptures the pawn, it can play queen out to f3, which is putting 2 attackers on the knight on d5. So to defend against that, black has to play pawn to c6. Now white can recapture the pawn on f4. Black can fianchetto the bishop, which would be attacking an undefended d4 pawn. From here, white can develop its knight out to e2, and then you have a knight out to d7 from black. And this position is also very tricky and requires a lot of sharp play from both sides. So all of this comes from the variation of playing pawn to g5. So the theory hasn't really been completely worked out yet, but I do encourage you to experiment with pawn to g5 in your own games and let me know what you come up with that. So continuing here with the main line, instead we have pawn captures on d5, and white can recapture with its pawn on capturing on e5. White can develop its knight to c6, and from here, white has to be careful. White still doesn't want to develop the knight to f3 because it can lead to a complicated position. For example, the bishop can come down and again pin the knight down to the queen. white can push the pawn to e6, and after the pawn captures on e6, white can push the pawn to c5. From here, black can save the knight and jump it to d5, and the bishop can come out to b5, which is pinning down the knight to the king now. Black can actually play queen to d7. White can develop its knight to d2, and then you have pawn to g6, which is getting ready to fianchetto the bishop onto g7. And from here you have queen to a3. Now this is actually doing three things. One, it's breaking the pin from the knight here on f3. Two, it's backing up the bishop along this diagonal against the king and the queen. And three, it's putting a direct defender on the d4 square. From here, black is going to fianchetto the bishop, and white is going to play knight to e5. Now, notice that if black had not fianchettoed this bishop, this knight would be a beast. It would be attacking the queen, it would be attacking a pinned piece here on c6, and it would be attacking an undefended bishop on g4. However, since black has fianchettoed the bishop, that's not a problem. Black can simply capture the knight, and after white recaptures, black can jump its knight down to e3, which is defending the bishop on g4. From here, white can play queen to e4, which is attacking the knight, and actually in this position, black can play something tricky and completely ignore that attack and simply castle on the king side, because once the queen captures the knight on e3, you have knight to b4, which is very strong. For example, if black makes a mistake and captures the queen here on d7, well then you have knight to c2, and that's checkmate, game over. Alternatively, you might see something like the queen play to c3 to try to defend against the checkmate, and from here the black queen can capture the bishop on b3, and again has a lot of threats against an uncastled king, which is in the center of the board and very exposed. So that's why you still, on move 7, if we go back here, move 7 of the main line, you still, as white, do not want to develop your knight to f3 in this position, and instead simply develop your bishop to e3, which is getting another defender on this d4 square. You'll note that it was under attack twice and defended only once by the queen, but now it's defended twice with the bishop on e3. Now, continuing with the main line, black is going to develop its bishop to f5. White is going to develop its knight to c3. You'll have pawn to e6 from black. Now white can develop its knight to f3. And from here, black actually has two options. One is going to be queen to d7. And playing can continue as follows. You have white developing its bishop to e2. You have black castling long and white castling short. Black can push the pawn to f6. White can push the pawn to d5. The knight can capture the pawn on e5, and then you have a series of exchanges on e5. And in this position, it's a pretty solid position. You have opposite side castling, which I should just say briefly, usually means that it's going to be a race to the king for both players. And yeah, this is a pretty solid position. Alternatively, if we go back, one more option after the knight develops to f3. This is move 9 for black in the main line. You might simply just see the bishop play to e7. From here, white can develop its bishop to e2. Both sides can castle, and then you have pawn to f6, which is getting ready to attack the center for white. So, those are all of the variations in the 4-pawn attack of the Alekhine's defense. And again, I hope to have the videos on the exchange and the modern variations up soon. Do be sure to check out the Grandmaster game with the 4-pawn attack, and questions and comments are certainly welcome. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.